the central premise of Al Gore's climate change films is impossible. Okay, I'm not saying just merely wrong or exaggerated. I mean literally impossible. You see, Mr. Gore says that he's telling us the truth about climate science. After all, his 2006 film was called An Inconvenient Truth. And his film this year was called An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. But Mr. Gore does not know the truth about the causes and consequences of climate change. Indeed, no one does. That's because science is not about truth. Science is the opinion of experts, and they could be wrong. Now, before I go any further, I better quote Voltaire, because he said, "If you wish to converse with me, define your terms." He knew how definitions directed and restricted debates, and actually at times determined outcomes. So I better explain to you what I mean by truth, okay? Because truth is something that different people have different definitions. I'm using the Platonic definition. See, Plato said that truth was something that was universal, necessary, and certain. Okay, that's easy to remember. The abbreviation would be universal, necessary, and certain. That would be UNC, United Nations Climate. Okay, so I remember it easily that way. Universal means that whatever they're talking about happens everywhere. It happens in Athens, it happens in Ottawa, and it happens on a planet circling the star Alpha Centauri. Okay, it's universal. It also occurs every when. It occurs now. It's true in 5 minutes, and it's true in 1 billion years. So that's the universal part. The necessary is that it has to be the way it is. There's no other explanation possible. It is unequivocal, okay? So that's universal, necessary, and the last one is certain. Certain says that it is not probable, it's not 99% likely, it is certain, it is in the bank, okay? So that's universal, necessary, and certain. And that's how Plato defined truth. Now this applies to our things like mathematics, okay? Where we write the rules. 2 + 2 = 4. That's true. But it never applies to our findings about nature, which are merely educated opinions based on scientists' interpretations of their observations. And philosophers since ancient times have known that observations cannot prove anything true. Not only are our methods of observation imperfect, I mean, there's always inaccuracies and how did you use the equipment and that sort of thing, but the whole concept of truth based on observation makes no sense because our interpretation is very much subject to our internal biases, how we see the world, how our society sees the world. Now, this is not a new idea. In the 17th century, Sir Francis Bacon called what he actually identified this thing. He called it the idols of the mind, okay? This was where inherent traits and social biases influences the observer. So the observer will see things that maybe aren't actually there. Okay? A good example is the idol of the tribe. That afflicts all human beings. That is where, in fact, we have a tendency to put more evidence, more weight on supportive evidence for our ideas than we do on an equal amount of negative evidence. Okay? That's the idol of the tribe. It also applies to things like we see prettier patterns than actually really exist. People who think that carbon dioxide drives climate change, they see these patterns of CO2 and climate change, global temperature going up together, and they see it all through the record. But what they don't see is when they go the opposite direction. Okay? So we look for patterns to support our ideas. Bacon's idols of the mind also included the idol of the cave, and this applies to individuals. You know, we all have our own private hobby horse that we ride, and we tend to see the world, you know, in the light of that particular point of view. And also, of course, idols of the theater, idols of the marketplace, things that actually are influenced by our education. Now, Gore is not alone in this idea that we know the truth about climate change. I mean, that's a mistake, of course, but climate activists say this all the time. They say that we know the truth about what's going to happen in the future, and it's based on settled science, they say. Settled science. Well, settled science doesn't actually exist. The whole point of science is to be skeptical and ask questions. Unfortunately, the United Nations actually leads the way in this mistake. At the beginning of their 2007 synthesis report, they say, and I quote, okay, very dramatic, got all headlines all over the world, "The warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is evidenced by the observations of da-da-da-da-da." Okay? Now, it's interesting that Lehigh University professor Stephen Goldman, he actually supports the idea that we are causing dangerous climate change. But he says that the UN statement is flawed And I should just read to you what he actually said, okay? Because it's interesting. Remember, this is a person who supports the idea that we're causing dangerous climate change. He says that the UN statement is an attempt to persuade extra-logically. In other words, something not determined by logic. Strictly logically, no observations can lead to an unequivocal interpretation. Remember, unequivocal, which is what the UN uses frequently, means there can be no other explanation possible. And he's saying, it doesn't work, okay? Philosophy says that's wrong. Dr. David Wojcik, who actually disagrees with Dr. Goldman on the causes of climate change, he's a specialist in the logic and philosophy of science, but he too says that the UN statement is wrong. He says reasoning from evidence is inductive logic. As for unequivocal, that is never the case in inductive logic. So imagine the first sentence in what is pretty well the most important document in climate change in the whole world is impossible, okay? Which I find kind of stunning that people aren't pointing that out. Now, the promotion of absolute truth in science has impeded human progress for centuries. And I'll give you a good example. In the 2nd century AD, the Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy proposed an Earth-centered universe system. Now, he didn't say that this was physical astronomy. He didn't say this was the way the universe really worked. What he said was this was a mathematical astronomy that was good for creating calendars, for astrology, and for making observations. It was the ultra-conservative Catholic Church that took Ptolemy's theory and incorporated it with a literal interpretation of the Bible and made it absolute truth to be questioned at one's peril. And that's exactly why Copernicus, who had a sun-centered universe theory, that's why he waited 30 years until he was on his deathbed before he allowed his book to be published. It's interesting that shortly later, the church put Copernicus's book on the list of prohibited books, and it stayed there for 200 years, okay? So when authorities preach truth about science, progress stops. Albert Einstein once said, "Whoever undertakes to set himself up as a judge of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods." Well, it might be funny to the gods when people say they know the future of climate change, but when you think about it, we're spending $1 billion a day across the world on this highly uncertain cause. Imagine what you could do with $1 billion a day more on healthcare, or schools, or education, or nursing homes, or cleaning up our rivers. It's time we opened up the debate about this, one of the most costly and complex issues of our era. Thank you very much.